They put a for sale sign in my yard like it was a joke, bright white, clean edges, the kind of sign you buy at office supply stores and nail into somebody else's life. And the woman who walked up the drive with the realtor had that look people get when they think they've already won, like she was spotting a prize and nobody had told her it belonged to someone else. I remember standing at the mailbox with my coffee, watching the sign wobble in the wind, and thinking, no, not today, because that little crooked piece of plywood was the first move in a game I hadn't agreed to play. My name's Frank Mercer. I run a small carpentry shop in a town that remembers you by your first dog's name. And that cabin out back belonged to my grandmother before it was mine. It's not a mansion, 2 bedrooms, a loft, a porch that creaks the way old houses do when they remember the people who lived in them, but it's every line of my family's story folded into one place. When someone tries to rewrite that story overnight, you don't get mad fast, you get deliberate. That's how I am. Deliberate. The woman, her name was Liza Cole. Or at least that's what the card said. She had the audacity of someone who's made a career of taking edges off other people's lives. Frank, she said, smiling like she already had the deed. We need to talk about community standards and the sale. Behind her, the realtor snapped a picture of the sign, like a trophy photo. I walked up to them slow, the porch boards humming under my boots, and I could feel my chest go tight in that way it does before you speak something you mean. You can't put that up, I said. And I meant it plain. This property's not for sale. Liza smiled wider, which made her eyes smaller. Mr. Mercer, according to the HOA and the recorded transfer, this property is now in the community trust. We're just enforcing communal rights. She talked like a woman reciting a script she'd practiced in front of a mirror. We'd like to access the property to assess the structure. There's a number for situations like that, the sheriff's non-emergency line. But my old training I used to teach evidence handling downstate a while back flagged 100 small things in her voice. The paper she slid across the hood of the realtor's car had a stamp and a signature. It had all the trimmings. It looked real in the way counterfeit money looks real if you don't hold it to the light. I refused to hand over the gate code. That afternoon, they tried to make it a legal problem. The deed they showed a neighbor, the notarized-looking thing, had my family's name misspelled, the county clerk's seal a shade off. The sheriff came out, polite, buttoned up in a uniform that meant order. He read the documents and said, "We'll have to check the recorder's office." He left with a promise that sounded like a placeholder. And as his cruiser pulled away, I realized the whole situation had been built to buy me time, and that whatever was coming was already on a schedule. This is where I want to be honest. For a long time I thought I could outpaper someone. I thought evidence, right up to a courthouse filing, would be enough. But what surprised me was the way greed smooths its edges. It looks like bureaucracy. It speaks in forms. The transfer 2 weeks prior, in the clerk's index, that was the thing that landed in my stomach like a cold stone. I wanted to quit then, give in to the feeling that the world had shifted under me. But my grandmother's voice has a stubbornness that runs in my blood, and I couldn't stand the thought of her cabin being turned into a payday. So I worked in the margins. I reviewed home surveillance backups. I'd never thought to check the little camera over the shed, the timestamp stamped footage that every homeowner assumes will never be necessary. I started calling people who owe favors and people who know how to read a ledger the way a carpenter reads grain. There's a small-town mechanic named Ray who knows everyone's truck and everyone's grudges. There's an old clerk at the recorder's office who remembers the clerk's nephew used to help people with forms. Little threads. I pulled. Midway through that week, a black SUV rolled up like a bad omen, glossy, tinted, unfamiliar plates, and a man stepped out with gloves and a suit that cost more than my truck. He called himself a representative of the buyer. His name was Carter Voss. Carter had the kind of low voice that makes threats sound like weather reports. He spoke carefully, like a man who'd spent a long time learning how to say cruel things in polite rooms. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "you make this difficult and you make this messy. Neither of those are good for anyone." He was right about one thing. Making it messy would be good for them. Mess is the sort of thing that lets people hide in corners. But the uglier truth was, I had more control than I looked like I did. I had backups, and I had a memory of how paperwork gets faked: the notaries who glance away for a second, the courier who takes a package and drops it where nobody's watching. More than anything, I had neighbors who resent being steamrolled. Small towns have long memories, and an uneven sense of justice tends to make people act in unpredictable ways. That night, The men who came were wearing hoodies, not suits, gloves, masks, cans that rattled like they wanted fire more than money. They moved at midnight, because midnight gives you a kind of permission to be cruel. I saw their van through the trees, a dark chunk against the road, and I felt something old and animal, the way a person's voice becomes steel when their home is threatened. I walked out onto the porch, and I let the night keep most of my shape. I could have called the sheriff, but there's a difference between waiting for someone to come and showing up yourself when it matters. So I did what any red-blooded, stubborn homeowner might do. I made myself visible. Hands where I can see them. I called into the dark, because someone has to use words first. One of them swore, a short, sharp sound. I kept speaking without shouting, because shouting is what gets you in trouble in movies. In real life, a steady voice makes people pause. "You got the wrong house," I said, when they hesitated. The man with the bolt cutters took a step forward like he was reading a cue from someone else's script. "We have orders," he said. "Move." The next few seconds were something I still replay in my head: the way headlights washed the yard, the way breath showed in the cold, the way the officer's lights cut through the fog like punctuation. Ray, the mechanic, had driven by and guessed something was wrong. He didn't have a badge, but he had a flashlight, and he had the kind of incredulous look that makes men with bolt cutters think twice. The sheriff's cruiser rolled down the lane like an answer to a prayer. In a flash, the equation changed from men thinking they could do what they wanted to a small town policing itself. The masked men fumbled, voices cracking, and one of them tried to run. The headlights caught his face. We took statements in the dawn. One of the captured operatives talked too much in the back of the cruiser. Names dropped, places, a payment schedule that sounded like laundering. The sheriff called it what it was: conspiracy, impersonation, attempted destruction of property. The woman who'd put the sign up, Liza Cole, had lawyers on speed dial, but suddenly her name looked a little less clean. Carter Voss's call started going unanswered. Here's the part people like to skip when they tell hero stories. Victories have paperwork. You clear out the wreckage, and then you sit in a room with fluorescent lights and sign forms that make the story boring again, and you wait while the machine of justice grinds. It takes time, and it asks you for small humiliations like describing exactly how you felt in front of a counsel, or reading the chain of emails that proves a conspiracy. It's tedious, but it's also where truth accrues, like sediment on a riverbed, until it becomes undeniable. We won in the way small towns win. Not with grand speeches, but with neighbors who remembered and records that didn't add up. Liza's signature on the deed was traced back to a notary who swore they'd never been there on that day. Carter's company had shell addresses. The county prosecutor loved details like that. The sheriff called me in late one afternoon with the kind of voice that carries good news between two people who owed each other patience. "We've got enough for charges," he said. "They're going down." After the arrests, two men in masks, one in cuffs who kept saying he was just following orders, and two people who thought a forged signature would do the trick. I walked the property line slowly like a man, making sure his bones were still where he left them. The porch board that squeaked under my boot sounded the same. My grandmother's kettle still sat on the stove. The cabin felt smaller and bigger at the same time, like an old book opened after someone tried to tear out a chapter. Walking back inside that evening, I felt a complicated kind of relief. Not joy, relief, and a sadness that comes with knowing how close you are to losing the thing you love. The town talked for a while, and then it moved on. People go back to their own weather and their own business, and that's how small places heal. But there's also a scar, the kind you can't see unless you're listening, and I like to think it taught people something about looking at a neighbor's life and asking before they cut corners. I'm not a hero. I'm a man who refuses to let pieces of his family be bought overnight. And I was lucky that some small things worked in my favor: footage, neighbors, the kind of stubbornness that runs in my blood. If there's a lesson here, maybe it's this. Property is a shape of memory, and when someone tries to change that shape with paperwork and pretense, the truth is often in the small things: a misspelled name, a shaky notary, a neighbor who remembers what really happened. So tell me, where do you stand? Is this a battle you'd fight in the same way, or would you fold and write it off as a cost of living? Do you think the law always gets it right, or do you think small towns need their own kind of justice? Drop a comment, tell me what you would have done, and if you've ever seen someone try to steal a story like that from a family, share it, because the more we talk about this kind of thing, the more we make it hard for people to pretend they can buy other people's history with a clean contract and a smile. If you like the story, share it with someone who cares about home, and subscribe for more. I'll keep telling the stories that don't deserve to be forgotten.